The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is the 5th day of this 7-day sesshin here in May 2021 at Mountain Gate in northern New Mexico, the 2nd of 2 in a row sesshin, which is an excellent way to do practice. Earlier in sesshin, I shared with you Kala Rinpoche's writings on the nature of mind, the openness, the unimpededness, the clarity that is our true nature, and that is always there, without fail. But he also spoke of the veils that prevent us from realizing that. At the same time, I want to share just one short paragraph from something that he wrote. Again, this is from this book, Luminous Mind, The Way of the Buddha, by Kalu Rinpoche, who was an eminent Tibetan master. He's been dead for quite a long time at this point, but we had the privilege of hearing his voice, hearing him personally speak in Santa Fe many times, as he would come through Santa Fe in the 1980s and work with his students at the stupa there. And we were all friends together, we Buddhists, we the Zen folks and they the Tibetan Buddhists, supporting each other as we sought to build our respective practice centers in Santa Fe or on the outskirts of Santa Fe. So here's what he says about karma and freedom. And it is karma that creates these veils and continues these veils. And karma, as you may know, is cause and effect. And in our deluded mind states, we create conditions to continue that delusion. And awakening is to awaken to the clear, open, unimpededness of our true mind, which means the necessity of clearing those veils. At the same time as we have these veils, he says, there is a freedom. We are continually confronted with a choice. The right choice generates karma favorable to positive development, while a bad choice produces negative karma, the cause for unhappiness in the future. The choice is ours, but the consequences are unavoidable. At the same time, he says, this freedom or free will is possible because in the midst of samsara, which is the deluded condition, despite its conditioned nature, we always have a degree of direct awareness and authentic experience. Our mind and its experiences participate simultaneously in the conditioning of ignorance and in the freedom of direct awareness. And all of you who are listening to this Teisho have experienced some level of that direct awareness, that unimpeded awareness, that glimpse, tiniest, perhaps, glimpse of a potential to experience this unimpeded, clear, open mind that we are. Now I'd like to share a couple of significant supports of this. One is by Albert Einstein, of all people. He was a rather unusual human being and understood intuitively how to open to a deep, broad essence of mind, rather than, in other words, to go beyond his thinking mind. And he writes, a human being is a part of the whole that we call the universe. apart, limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings as something separate from the rest, a kind of optical illusion of his consciousness. That's those veils. This illusion is a prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for only the few people nearest us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living beings and all of nature. Interesting how perceptive he was. And then I'd like to quote once more Huangpo, or Obaku, who was a Chinese master during the famous Tang Dynasty, the golden age of Zen. And he writes, "This pure mind, which is the source of all things, shines forever with the radiance of its own perfection. But most people are not aware of it and think that the mind is just a faculty that sees, hears, feels, and knows. Blinded by their own sight, hearing, feeling, and knowing, they don't perceive the radiance of the source. If they could eliminate all conceptual thinking, this source would appear, like the sun rising through the empty sky and illuminating the whole universe. Therefore, you students of the Tao who seek to understand through seeing, hearing, feeling, and knowing, when your perceptions are cut off, your way to mind will be cut off, that's small m, and you will find nowhere to enter. Just realize that although mind is manifested in these perceptions, it is neither part of them nor separate from them. You shouldn't try to analyze these perceptions or think about them at all, but you shouldn't seek the one mind apart from them. Don't hold on to them or leave them behind or dwell on them or reject them. Above, below, and around you, all things spontaneously exist because there is nowhere outside of this Buddha mind." Now we're going to jump to another contemporary Chinese master. This is Guo Gu, who is a Dharma successor of the master Sheng Yen, who is essentially contemporary. I mean, he died more than 10 years ago, but he has been instrumental in bringing a more authentic Chan practice to people all over the world, including people in Taiwan, people elsewhere. He was born and raised in mainland China. As a child, his family was so poor that he was sent out as the youngest child in the family to find weeds that they could eat. And that's what they survived on, was weeds. The result of that was in his earlier years, he was considered quite dull and lacking of intelligence. And it's, I'm sure, because of his lack of sufficient diet. When the Yangtze River flooded seriously and thousands of people died, the land that his father rented in order to raise vegetables to sell, to survive, was washed away. And so suddenly they had not even that. When he was 13 years old, his parents were urged to marry him off to a local girl who was also known to be lacking in intelligence. And at the same time, his mother was a devout Buddhist, particularly devoted to Guan Yin, the Bodhisattva of compassion. And as a devout Buddhist, she was periodically visited by a local the local priest of a temple. And when he heard of the plan to marry Shengyan off to this young girl, he said, well, why don't you just send him to my monastery? And so they did. And once he was in the monastery, it was a monastery that emphasized studying the sutras. And a couple of things happened. One is that he was given a much more healthy diet. And the other is that in his attempts to memorize the sutras, which were required, that was part of the practice at this temple, he kept failing over and over again. And finally, he resolved to do 500 prostrations to Guan Yin, beseeching the Bodhisattva of compassion to have pity on him and help him memorize these sutras, in particular one. And so he worked steadily on doing the 500 prostrations. Now, to even do 100 prostrations in one fell swoop is extremely challenging. Not so much if you're in good shape in the doing of it, but in the aftermath, in which case you have extreme pain in your legs from all the prostrations. But I think it was actually 500 prostrations a day or something like that. It wasn't just 500 prostrations, which is not that many really. The Tibetan preliminary practices involve 100,000 prostrations. And people begin slowly. They'll do 25 a day. When I was in Singapore many, many years ago, on the way back from the conference of Western Buddhist nuns in Bodh Gaya, and housed in the second floor of this monastery, my father had just died, and on the grounds of the monastery was this beautiful small octagonal building with an enormous statue of a 1,000-armed Kuan Yin. And so I decided to dedicate 100 prostrations to my father. And so went around the side of the figure where I wouldn't be quite exactly in the way of people, and did 100 prostrations. And the next morning, trying to go downstairs to where I could get something to eat for breakfast was excruciating. I had to hang on to the handrail and kind of gradually, gingerly let myself down each step. So if you decide to go on a mission to do many prostrations, and they can be a tremendous offering in practice, particularly when we do them with such focus that we're just doing the prostration. We're not thinking about how many we're doing. We can take a mala, one of these Buddhist rosaries they're called, which has got 108 beads on it, and go around using our thumb to move from bead to bead. Or we can, we don't have a mala, we can use beans, dried beans, or something similar, stones. At Sogenji, when we did the early morning sutra in the bell tower, we had to ring the bell so many times. We had stones. There were stones placed out, and we would just move the stones to count the number of times we were ringing that big bell. But it can be a deep, deep practice. And what it did, besides helping him focus his mind and combined with a healthier diet, which nourished his brain, it's well known that exercise is quite excellent for maintaining brain capacity, memory, and simple capacity of the brain. So he ultimately ended up many years later in Japan at a Rinzai Buddhist monastery, or not monastery, university, where he actually encountered Roshi Kapleau, by the way, getting a PhD in Buddhist studies, because he was on a mission by that point in time to clarify the essence of Buddhism for the people of Taiwan, because Chinese Buddhism up to that point had gotten quite corrupted in a certain way through a lot of mythological stuff and magical stuff, and the actual essence of the practice was kind of buried beneath all of that. And he sought to reveal the true essence of that practice, and he has been quite successful at it. Guogu was, I believe, his first successor, and Guogu is now a professor at, I think, Eastern Florida University. He decided to leave his robes, to disrobe as a monk, because he felt he could be more accessible to ordinary folks if he was a layperson. And this was the same view, manifested slightly differently, of Yamada Momonroshi, who was Harada Shodaroshi's teacher. He is pictured as having relatively long hair and a little beard. And he felt that if he were to go around shaven-headed in his robes, it was going to be not necessarily off-putting, but it would make him remote appearing to ordinary people. And he wanted to be accessible to human beings, to all people. And so he kind of went halfway. He still wore the robes, but he did not shave his head and he did not shave his beard. And something similar has taken place with regard to those of us who are Dharma successors of the Rochester Zen Center and Philip Kapleau Roshi. Originally, there were shaved heads. At that point, there were no women who were ordained yet, but the guys that were ordained shaved their heads and wore black. And at one point, Zenson came to the Roshi and said, you know, people are afraid of us or suspicious of us. Why don't we, instead of wearing black, why don't we go with navy blue, which is the Rinzai robes, Rinzai winter robes are navy blue, and maybe not shave our head so completely. And so that has come down to the present day, which is why I have hair on my head, and although it's short, and that is the requirement is short hair, and we don't have any, well, we do have limits in what we wear, but we do not have to go around in samugi, which is the Japanese form of monk or nun wear in current Japan. Samugi means work clothing, and it was originally the clothing of the farmers. Up until the mid-1960s, Buddhist monks in Japan actually did everything in the robes, which, given that these robes are quite ponderous, they are inherited from Sung Dynasty China, and so they have very big long sleeves. In those days, a wealthy person had clothing that had very long sleeves to prove that they didn't have to work with their hands, that they were wealthy enough that they didn't need to have short sleeves, which would have made it easier to work with their hands. And so we have these ponderous robes, and there's ways of hitching them up and tying the sleeves back to do work. But it's still a bit challenging to dig ditches and do garden work and do kitchen work and so on in your full robes, particularly the winter robes, which are quite heavy. So in the 1960s, the Rinzai monasteries, and I think probably Soto also, adopted the use of samugi, the farmer clothing, to wear outside of the zendo. And nowadays, it's considered rather elegant wear, and lay people will sometimes wear samugi as a, it's not quite a wannabe, but it's close, identifying with Zen Buddhist practitioners in Japan. So Gogu is an amazing human being. He's very ordinary, as befits someone who has opened deeply to the nature of mind. There's nothing special. And that's one of the amazing things of having a Kensho experience, is you recognize that this mind that you catch a glimpse of is profoundly amazing, and yet at the same time, not at all special, quite ordinary. So this is a book called Silent Illumination, and I've mentioned it before in other teishos. I highly recommend it. It's called A Chan Buddhist Path to Natural Awakening. And I'd like to share, let's see if I can find the page. This is about these veils and how to release these veils, melt these veils, let go these veils that veil our true, clear, open, unimpededness of mind. First, he quotes Huineng. Good friends, since the past, this teaching of ours has first taken no thought as its principle, no form as its essence, and non-abiding as its foundation. No thought means to be without thought, quote unquote, in the midst of thinking. No form is to transcend form within the context of forms and appearances. And non-abiding is your fundamental nature. All worldly things are empty. And as you may recall, the sixth patriarch, Huineng, who is this person who is being quoted, came to a profound awakening experience on hearing a part of the Diamond Sutra being recited by a wandering pilgrim. And that sentence was, arouse the mind that abides nowhere. Arouse the mind that abides nowhere. Now, we can mistakenly think that abiding nowhere means being blank. But as he explained, no thought means to be without thought in the midst of thinking. And no form is to transcend form within the context of forms and appearances. Non-abiding is your fundamental nature. All worldly things are empty. And Gogu goes further. Thoughts, feelings, and narratives are what we grasp internally. Form is what we grasp externally, and this can include our bodies, objects, environment, status, wealth, and appearances. None of these objects of grasping are in and of themselves bad. Sometimes they're needed to help us navigate through life and improve our circumstances. However, when our grasping is driven by possessiveness or obsession, it brings about suffering for ourselves and for others. Non-abiding is just a Chan way or a Zen way of saying non-grasping. Everything is fluid, changing, open to opportunities. This is how things, including ourselves, are. Nothing is fixed or rigid. we can feel like these thoughts are going around and around, the same old thoughts, around and around and around, and we're helpless against it. We're not. They're not fixed. They're not permanent. Just as a nightmare, when we have a dream in the middle of the night, or even a good dream in the middle of the night, and we wake up and it's not there anymore. It is the same with these thoughts, ideas, concepts, and so on. And it's the attachment to them that brings forth these veils. The thoughts themselves are not a problem. Yeah, they may be annoying, but that's our problem, is the feeling of annoyance. We can work with that. But again, it's important to recognize they are not fixed. They're not permanent. And as such, particularly given what Kala Rinpoche has said about this innate freedom that we have even in the midst of the challenge of delusion. Those veils can be melted and dropped. And here's some more. Grasping and rejecting are always based on our self-referential obsessions. If we're captivated or repulsed by whatever comes up in our practice, then it gains power over us, and the problem becomes worse. When difficulties arise, it's important to see them clearly, accept them. Oh shit, not that again. Well, okay. Open my arms, and I don't have to like it, but it's here, so I can recognize that it's here, at least momentarily, and leave off any judgment of it or any attempts to get rid of it. When we try to get rid of something like an obsession or a thought, it only makes it stronger. We're playing tug of war with ourselves, with our deluded selves. When difficulties arise, it is important to see them clearly, accept them, work with them, and let them go. The true nature of things is non-abiding, fresh, and dynamic. So, how to do that? Modern psychology has returned to a recognition of something that was taught actually by Longchenpa, who was an ancient Tibetan master. And he spoke of, and I'll paraphrase it, when difficult feelings arise, difficult thoughts arise, tune in. Allow yourself to feel the bare energy of these thoughts or difficult feelings in the first moment before karma is developed. And then in the second moment, rest in the experience of that. And in that moment, these thoughts, reactions, concepts, and so on that seem so permanent, those emotions are dissolved, and we are freed in the midst of them without having to get rid of them. Many years ago, back in the late 70s, early 80s, Eugene Gendlin was a graduate student in psychology, and he did a study along with his mentor on trying to discern why or how some people were able to spend years in psychotherapy and never budge an inch in terms of their freedom from their issues. And other people, within the first 3 meetings with the therapist were able to begin to become free. What was the difference? And they found very quickly that the difference was those people who actually were able to tune in to the physical sensations in their body, to tune in to the sense of whatever difficult, challenging feeling there was, were able to rapidly move beyond these. And it is about offering radical acceptance. Okay, this is how it feels right now. I don't have to like it, but it's here. I may as well admit it and accept the fact that here it is what it feels like. And when we do that, it's quite amazing. It just dissolves. And we can suddenly go much deeper in our practice. He wrote a book that I've recommended many, many times over called Focusing. And that's what he termed it. It was focusing on what he said, the felt sense within our body. Not the ideas, not the pictures, not the assumptions, not the stories, but what the energy in our body felt like in that moment, or feels like in this moment. And when we tune in fully, and this can take practice, because any of us who have experienced any level of trauma have normally chosen to escape from our bodies. And we do that by denying feelings, dissociating from our feelings, living out of our heads. I remember a good friend of mine spoke of her younger daughter, who always seemed to be having accidents in the lower part of her body. She'd break her toes or whatever. This is a little kid. And eventually, because she had some psychic ability, this child, she recalled being raped and murdered as a teenager and dumped in a trash can in a different life. And the residue of that trauma was continuing within this life. She did many, many years of very successful psychotherapy and is today a wonderful adult, just a beautiful human being. And there's no apparent residue of the past in it. To tune in to what the energy in our body is when something is, and when we find ourselves in a difficult mind state, just as Longchenpa said, you tune into the sense of this mind state. No matter what it is, it doesn't really matter what it is. And as you tune in fully enough to feel the sensory experience of it, you find space, amazing space and amazing presence. And he goes on to say, it is freed in its own place without having to be gotten rid of. That's how you melt the veils. Extending the out breath with this openness to possibility, riding on the out breath, this reaching through the extended out breath for you don't know what, but there's something that you've inherently understood that you're not quite in touch with at the moment. And that is really, really important to return to experiencing. We do that over and over and over again, and gradually it thins out these veils. And when different obstructive thoughts arise, then we practice the radical acceptance, feel their energy, and allow ourselves to sink deep into that energy in the felt sense of our body and allow it to dissolve. And we know it has dissolved when there is this sense of palpable relief. There's quite a learning curve on it, but it is possible to reach this ability to truly become free of whatever might arise in our minds. It takes work. It takes attention. It takes returning again and again to our attempts to feel the sensations in our body, not the stories, not the pictures, not the ideas, not the concepts, but the felt sense. It's liberating. And it takes us a long way deeper into our practice. And then thinking returns to simply becoming the tool it is by nature. It can be quite helpful, but it is far from the universal. It is something that is appropriately used. It's under certain circumstances, but it is not by any means our whole life. And if we use it to drive our perceptions, we are creating an enormous prison around ourselves, or maybe not so enormous, it's a very tight prison. So we have the tools and the understanding, the knowledge to free ourselves from these veils. It takes a long time, but once we get the hang of it, it is a marvelous practice. It's so exciting to find yourself in a challenging mind state and to tune in and to feel the release almost immediately. It changes our lives. So I think that's enough for today. I thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.